Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. While we're taking a break from First Age Friday and the Lay of Lathian to go back to Fandom Fridays, we're continuing in our read-through of the story of Aldarion and Erendis this series, so let's go ahead and get going with that on Week 54's Second Age Saturday. We're going to pick up where we left off at the end of Week 53, after Erendis' rejection of the king's request to come attend the proclamation of Aldarion as the next king of Numenor. Now, last week's reading also concluded the finished part of the story, but there are still significant moments that Christopher Tolkien has brought to light in the rest of the chapter, and we'll be reading through these over the second half of this series. Now, the next parts of the story, or the remaining parts of the story, come in a section entitled The Further Course of the Narrative, and Christopher explains. From the point where Aldarion read the letter from Erendis, refusing to return to Armenelos, the story can only be traced in glimpses and snatches from notes and jottings. And even those do not constitute the fragments of a wholly consistent story, being composed at different times and often at odds with themselves. Indeed, sometimes they are at odds, just like we see in the history of Galadriel and Celeborn, but sometimes they're not. So let's keep reading. Now, this time, unlike the finished part of the narrative, I am reading Christopher's editorial bits as well. I will try to make it clear when I transition between his words and the text. We'll start with Christopher's editorial text. It seems that when Aldarion became king of Numenor in the year 883, he determined to revisit Middle-earth at once, and departed for Mithlond either in the same year or the next. It is recorded that on the prow of Hirolande he set no bough of Oiolaire, but the image of an eagle with golden beak and jeweled eyes, which was a gift of Círdan. And now with the text. It perched there by the craft of its maker, as if poised for flight unerring to some far mark that it espied. This sign shall lead us to our aim, he said. For our return let the Valar care, if our deeds do not displease them. Back to Christopher. It is also stated that no records are now left of the later voyages that Aldarion made, but that it is known that he went much on land as well as sea, and went up the river Gwathlo as far as Tharbad, and there met Galadriel. There is no mention elsewhere of this meeting, but at that time Galadriel and Celeborn were dwelling in Eregion, at no great distance from Tharbad. Back to the text. But all Aldarion's labors were swept away. The works that he began again at Vinalonde were never completed, and the sea gnawed them. Nevertheless, he laid the foundation for the achievement of Tar Monastir long years after, in the first war with Sauron. And but for his works, the fleets of Numenor could not have brought their power in time to the right place as he foresaw. Already, the hostility was growing, and dark men out of the mountains were thrusting into Enedwaith. But in Aldarion's day, the Númenóreans did not yet desire more room, and his venturers remained a small people, admired, but little emulated. Christopher then explains, there is no mention of any further development of the alliance with Gil-galad, or of the sending of the aid that he requested in his letter to Tar-Meneldor. It is said indeed that, back to the text, Aldarion was too late or too early. Too late, for the power that hated Numenor had already waked. Too early, for the time was not yet ripe for Numenor to show its power or to come back into the battle for the world. And coming back to Christopher, there was a stir in Numenor when Tar Aldarion determined to return to Middle-earth in 883 or 884, for no king had ever before left the Isle, and the council had no precedent. It seems that Meneldor was offered, but refused the regency, and that Halatan of Hira-Storni became regent, either appointed by the council or by Tar Aldarion himself. Of the history of Ancalame during those years when she was growing up, there is no certain form. There is less doubt concerning her somewhat ambiguous character and the influence that her mother exerted on her. She was less prim than Erendis, and natively liked display, jewels, music, admiration, and deference. But she liked them at will and not unceasingly, and she made her mother and the White House in Emerie an excuse for escape. She approved, as it were, both Erendis' treatment of Aldarion on his late return, but also Aldarion's anger, impenitence, and subsequent relentless dismissal of Erendis from his heart and concern. She had a profound dislike of obligatory marriage, and in marriage of any constraint on her will. Her mother had spoken unceasingly against men, and indeed a remarkable example of Erendis' teaching in this respect is preserved. And we'll get to that example of her teaching next week. But let's look at the passages we just read and see what we can find. And what first comes to mind is that he went all the way up the River Guathlo to Tharbad, where he met with Galadriel. Like Christopher says, at this point, she and Celeborn are living in Eregion. They don't leave Eregion for Lothlorien until Second Age 1350, nearly 500 years from this time. Now, we've looked at Guathlo before. It's translated Grey Flood, the more familiar name for the river for most of you. But Gwath here isn't actually gray, it's shadow, according to Tolkien, in the sense of dim light, owing to cloud or mist or in deep valleys. But that doesn't seem to fit, the land being almost flat, so much so that where the Glanduin and Mythaethel meet, we get a bunch of fens and marshes. Instead, as Tolkien writes in the history of Galadriel and Celeborn, the origin of the name Guathlo must be sought in history. In the time of the War of the Ring, the lands were still in places well wooded, especially in Minhiriath and in the southeast of Enedwaith, but most of the plains were grasslands. Since the Great Plague of the year 1636 of the Third Age, Minhiriath had been almost entirely deserted, though a few secretive hunterfolk lived in the woods. In Enedwaith, the remnants of the Dunlendings lived in the east, in the foothills of the Misty Mountains, and a fairly numerous but barbarous fisherfolk dwelt between the mouths of the Guathlo and the Angren, that's the Isen. But in the earlier days, at the time of the first explorations of the Númenóreans, the situation was quite different. Minhiriath and Enedwaith were occupied by vast and almost continuous forests, except in the central region of the Great Fens. The changes that followed were largely due to the operations of Tar Aldarion, the Mariner King, who formed a friendship and alliance with Gil-galad. And this is why I wanted to read this part, right? I mean, sure, why am I reading History of Galadriel and Celeborn? Because it ties us back to the story of Aldarion. Basically, Aldarion began the process of deforestation, which ended up leading to conflict with the native inhabitants of the land, which then led in turn to the land becoming uninhabited. As Tolkien writes, the devastation wrought by the Númenóreans was incalculable. And we read about how the land had become a desert, treeless but untilled. Finally, we get to the part about the name Guathlo. We read, as soon as the seaward region of salt airs and great winds was past, the forest drew down to the riverbanks, and wide though the waters were, the huge trees cast great shadows on the river, under which the boats of the adventurers crept silently up into the unknown land. So the first name they gave to it was River of Shadow, Gwathir. Then after they got to the fens and thought it was the source of the river, they used the Sindarin word for the fens, lo, from a stem log, meaning wet, soaked, swampy, and changed Gwathir to Guathlo, the shadowy river from the fens. And folks, that does it for this week's Second Age Saturday. Thank you for joining me, and be sure to come back next week as we read Arendis' advice to Ancalame about the men of Númenor. Please visit patreon.com/TolkienTimes to learn how you can support the show, get an ad-free feed, join my content council, get a bonus episode every week, and more. And please, if you're watching this on YouTube, you know the drill, like and subscribe. Please follow or subscribe in your podcast apps and follow @TolkienTimes on social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.